so don't laugh at me, don't be unkind. In your practice evaluation, and in that, we ask you to take a baseline of your knowledge, your skills, and your confidence. And they are different things, of course, in relation to what we talked about. And it's actually quite a happy accident, because having heard Lynn romp through this agenda, I hope you feel better able actually to score yourself. And I should be clear, we don't take these results, send them back to your manager, send them off to whichever inspectorate supports you in your work or anything like that. It's for you. Just take a quick temperature check. Where are you in terms of your knowledge, your skills and your confidence in relation to the topics that Lynn's just taken us through? And at the end of the day, your return to that is it's entirely for you to get a sense of how you spent the day, what's about to stop. Okay? I'm watching you, Andrew, and I don't see you ticking those boxes. So, you know, thank you. It's a small enough crowd, I can think on the image. So that was a really, really helpful framing. But of course, we wouldn't be research and practice for adults if we didn't specifically and explicitly foreground some very correct research. I'm really pleased that we've got Alisoun. Alisoun is a member of what's known as the G8, which is a group, is that the correct collective now?
Yes.
Of academics working in gerontological social work. And I think you've been described by many as a leading light. And I've only met you this morning, and I'm already a huge fan. So no pressure. Take it away.
I think I need the clicking
You do
thing.
need this. Narrow and closing forward.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed, Des, and thank you very much for RiPfA for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be here, honoured to be here. I just want to say a couple of things by way of introduction. Firstly, that I am a professor of social work and social gerontology at the University of Kent. I was a social worker for over 10 years, I'm a qualified social worker, in the 1990s, and have been in academia for over 20 years now in various roles, and have been in the social work department at Kent for the last 8 or 9 years. Des has already mentioned the Gerontological Social Work Academic Special Interest Group, the G8 for short, partly because, well, actually there aren't 8 of us, there's only 7, soon to be 8 again, but we quite like it because it's kind of short and sweet. I just want to pay tribute to the other members of that group, Mo Ray, Sally Richards, Denise Tanner, and Liz Lloyd, and 2 newer members, Emma Parry and Paul Willis, and we're just about to recruit an 8th member. It's not a formal group, it's really informal, but we do a lot of work together, and just about everything we do relates to the work that other members of the group are doing. For example, one of us is on the BASWA group that Lynn was talking about for developing older people's social work specialities. So what I want to do this morning is set the scene a bit in terms of kind of demographic and policy context, talk about what gerontological social work is, a bit about what we know about its effectiveness, in which context it works most effectively, what evidence is there that it does, who does it work well with, where it interleaves with strengths-based approaches, like what's the kind of particular common areas, briefly outline, if I have time, a couple of examples and models around strengths-based approaches with older people. And then I want to be critical, have a couple of slides on critical thinking. I recognise that my slides are very busy. I will skip through a couple, and Des is going to be trying to keep me to time, so good luck with that. Very happy to take questions at the end, and of course you're going to go away with the slides, so if you're suffering from insomnia of an evening, you can always sort of have a look through them, and do of course come back to me. So I do appreciate they're busy, so I suppose I'm saying, as I would to my students, listen and think and absorb and take the slides away and read them later. So firstly then, a bit about the context. It's already been said by Lynn that we are living in an ageing population. A lot of people think that an ageing population, including most students, is that people live longer. They are living longer, that's true. But a population that ages is not about how long people live, it's about the fact that there are fewer younger people. So that's a very important point to make, I think. There are particularly increasing numbers of very older people, and that is the group that is at risk of complex healthcare challenges, including dementia, which is one of the main challenges that we now face in the health social care system. The older population is, of course, increasingly varied and diverse as well. There are more older people who are living without children, more older people who are living away from their family, whose children may have emigrated. There are more lesbian and gay older people and more black and minority ethnic older people. So it's not just there's more older people, there are also, the population is more and more diverse, increasingly diverse, in fact. Also, there are more and more older people who are carers themselves. At least a third of the current population of older carers are older people themselves. In fact, 3/4 of all care to older people in the family is by other older people, which challenges the older people as takers, which I think is another dominant discourse. Of course, the policy emphasis is very much now on prevention, preventing the use of expensive and unnecessary long-term care, for example, promoting independence, promoting autonomy, promoting dignity, and personalised care for those people that need it. It is precisely this set of intersecting issues in this policy context that I would argue that social work with older people is best situated and can do a very good job. The other drivers I want to talk about are related to inequalities. Despite the overall improvement in living standards for older people, there is evidence of widening inequalities in relationship to income, social class, gender, ethnicity, and disability that persist into later life. The legacy of long-term exposure, for example, to socioeconomic disadvantage is strongly correlated with poor health outcomes, particularly if you've been poor across the whole of your life course. This includes the onset of illnesses, health problems, at an earlier chronological age and shorter life expectancy. For example, in Kensington and Chelsea, you live 12 more years, or 14 if you're a woman, than you do in inner city Glasgow. That's not coincidence, and that's not about life choices either. Life course and age-related inequalities are a key dimension of health, of need, and of lived experience. And this is an issue often eclipsed by a politically expedient discourse about choices, about diet and smoking, and personal responsibility for health. A third issue relates to the direction of travel of the care-related trends in the care system. 3 issues intersect to produce an uneven, complex, and fragmented system, if indeed you can call it a system at all. The first one is about cuts to public funding, particularly local authority spending. It's fallen by 10% since 2010, and the number of older people receiving local authority-funded care has fallen by 36%. And some of those who are now outside of the local authority tent are people with personal care needs. Almost 90% of all local authorities now respond only to needs that are substantial or critical. And there is related evidence that public sector cuts are placing older people at increased risk. Again, you'll know this from newspapers and from your own roles, of course, of readmission and admission to hospital, of delayed discharge from hospital, and premature care home admission. And that's not to take account of the pressure on carers and families. Access to care increasingly depends on what you can afford and where you live, rather than on what you actually need. A third issue relates to meeting the needs of older people who are unable or choose not to access self-directed care, the default choice of policymakers. For some groups of older people, perhaps people with advanced dementia, older people living in stressful circumstances, chronic poverty, stressed and overwhelmed older carers with health problems of their own, direct payments may not be appropriate or even desirable. And yet these are precisely the groups whose agency and autonomy is most threatened and whose right to support from the public sector is most compromised. Oh God, am I? I'll speed up. I don't know what I need to say much about this because Lynn has already mentioned some of the key points. I just want to highlight 3 things on this slide. I think that's the lot. Specialist social work with older people it's the skills and knowledge required are in addition to what I would call the usual social work skills. And they're here. 3 issues I just want to specify. Lynn's mentioned the life course. People don't arrive in old age from outer space. They've had a life course. Really important to take account of the life course in thinking about, working with, speaking to, planning care with older people and their families. A need to adopt what I call a biographical approach to assessment. You're going to have to do some sort of assessment as a social worker. We can pretend you don't, but that's what you're there to do most of the time. But do it through the lens of biography, taking account not only of what that person wants, but of what's happened in their lives. As Lynn said about the lady who's been a teacher, try and understand what that person wants, what their strengths are, what they like, what they enjoy, what they wish. Also, need and care are very intersecting in later life. They're intersecting concepts. They're also embedded in the life, in the context, and in relationships. Is social work with older people effective? There is some evidence about the effect of social work with older people. It's strongest in relationship to palliative care and in health-related settings, as noted by Moriarty and Manthorpe in their recent review of social work with adults, 2016. A number of studies specifically evidence that social work's effectiveness is based on a combination of skills, including assessment, knowledge about local resources, the ability to provide counselling and ongoing support, and to give empathic advice. Evidence that suggests that social workers are particularly effective in working with people at the end of life, helping older people manage age-related losses, such as increasing disability and health problems and bereavement, working with older people facing a transfer from one environment to another, such as being admitted to a care home or going back home after a hospital stay, and those older people facing a high degree of risk, for example, living with advanced dementia in your own home, when your family and perhaps other professionals don't think it's a good idea. What matters to older people in terms of social work is also really important. So user-generated evidence suggests that social work skills of advice and advocacy, negotiation with agencies and services, psychotherapeutic support, I've already mentioned, signposting and practical guidance are particularly important. Being there for the long haul has also been evidenced. A practice that prioritises relational dimensions of care and engagement with decision-making is highly valued by older people, particularly those with dementia for whom communication may not be straightforward. Research with older people themselves highlights the value placed on social workers' knowledge about specialist services, persistence, commitment, reliability, and being supportive, sympathetic, and prepared to listen. It's very important and notable that the social work process is evidenced as important to older people as outcomes. Moving then to strengths-based approaches. A number of these dimensions dovetail with strengths-based approaches, promoting independence, working with older people and their carers, recognising the role played by the family, community and social capital in maintaining and promoting mental health and well-being, and facilitating links with a range of resources are all examples. Enabling social workers to build up meaningful trust relationships and engage with older people's and their carers' narratives, make use of therapeutic skills, offer time-rich, nuanced assessments, and build on what matters are all welcome elements of the renewed emphasis on strengths-based approaches. A shift towards recognising older people's coping skills, often developed over a life course, is also welcome. How long have I got, Des? Right. I'm going to have to go over a little bit, I think. Thank you very much. I've got up 3 or 4 slides here, which are a sort of mixture of what I call kind of conceptual models and a couple of examples of strengths-based approaches. Take away from it what you will, but I'm a bit of a fan of models, and I feel I'm cheating you as an academic if I don't give you something that looks like a chart. So prepare for 3 charts. The first is not drawn from literature about strengths-based approaches. It's drawn from a Scottish executive report from 2006 called Changing Lives. It's a report about social workers' roles, 21st century roles. And I think it quite helpfully articulates sort of 4 levels of intervention, if you like, or 4 levels of social work activity. I won't read them, you can see them for yourselves. They dovetail, I think, quite closely with the kind of preventative literature as well, which talks about intervention kind of primary, secondary and tertiary. So it has that, it sort of resonates with that as well. And I think it has resonance with the strengths-based approach agenda too, in terms of working with communities, working with individuals, working with families, and working with organisations and agencies. So it resonates about levels of intervention, but it also resonates in terms of purview, engaging with universal services and the wider community. So I think that's potentially helpful. I've got 2 examples, which I think I'm probably just going to gallop through. The first example of strengths-based approach is work that's being done by a colleague, a friend and colleague who's an independent social worker who's working with 4 care homes in the southeast of England. Yes, you've guessed it, Kent. And she was employed by the manager of these 4 care homes to improve their CQC ratings. And she's done lots of things. I've highlighted 4 here, but they give a flavour of her approach is very much strengths orientated. It's about working with the residents of the care home, it's working with the staff, it's working with the relatives and the wider community to improve care and to improve their experience of care and to improve the quality of life of the residents in the care home. Just to pick on one, she helped the care homes think through how to retain really good staff who didn't really want to be managers. So she helped them develop a role called a care lead role. And these staff are promoted, they get paid more, and their whole function is to bring on new staff and to help train new staff to be excellent care workers. So that's just one example. So she's building on the strengths of those workers and using the care home organisation to embed that inside the system. The second example is a completely different. It's an early intervention service in the north of England that's targeting adults, mainly older people. It's a shop front. I think there might be more than one of them, actually. And this is all about working with where people are at. People tend to self-refer, though they can be referred by other agencies. And this is very much about building up a relationship with the older person, finding out what they want, drawing on services if they need them, often universal services. And one example that struck me, because the social worker who works in this service is quoted as saying, this is about reclaiming good social work. I can be creative. I'm free from the fetters of care management. I can do proper social work. And she talked about an example of a man who was labelled as a hoarder. He may or may not be one, I don't know. And he didn't want anyone to come into his house. So what she did was she worked with him. Sometimes they sat in her car or they went to the local park. So she felt she was able to actually engage with this man on his terms, on his turf, in a safe place. Also, there's evidence that this intervention delays the use of other services and is cost effective. And I must just make a plug for the RiPfA resource, which is working with complexity. Right, I'm sure I'm running terribly over. Okay. Right, 2 other models I just want to run through because I think they're really useful in terms of thinking about some of the things that Lynn identified earlier in a bit more depth. A closely aligned model to the strengths-based approach is the asset-based approach. Resilience is a core dimension of Antonovsky's model of salutogenesis, He identified an interaction between what he called generalised resistance resources, typically money, social support, psychological resources, etc., and a sense of coherence, the ability to make use of these, a salutogenic environment. This model is built on that, and it's by Wild et al. They reconceptualised the generalised resources as areas of resilience in later life. And as you can see, there's a number of them. It's not one concept. They also developed this further in terms of the salutogenic environment. It focuses on factors that promote positive health and well-being, rather than on factors that undermine health and well-being or cause illness and ill-being. And these elements can be conceptualized as levels of resilience. This model has been adapted and refined and found its way into health promotion and community development work. Both these conceptual models, areas and levels, have the advantage of conceptualizing resilience as broader than the individual. Resilience is beyond a personal characteristic. It also sees the individual in context and takes some account of the life course. It acknowledges that resilience is a dynamic concept that is about balance. An older person may have strengths in one part of their life and vulnerabilities in another, and this may change over time. For many older people with long-term comorbid conditions, being resilient means being able to adjust to change and loss and retain what is important. Critically and very importantly, a valued sense of self and identity. Right, 2 more slides. Got to get to me critical bit. However, there are a number of key challenges regarding the strengths-based approach. Whatever its value may be, it is embedded in a wider context. Swinging cuts to local authority budgets, the raising of eligibility criteria for social care to a very high level, and concerns about the market, excluding ever greater numbers of marginalised older people, undermine the potential of strengths-based approaches to deliver improved outcomes. An approach that emphasises individualisation also undermines the development of collective responses, especially if these require public funds, and struggles to engage with a discourse around addressing inequalities. Inequalities such as sexism and poverty are socially and structurally produced and thus require political solutions rather than personal ones. There are also concerns that an emphasis on strengths fails to address the complex and embedded nature of the difficulties that many older people who see a social worker have. Social work with older people often takes place in difficult circumstances when individuals and their families are under great stress, perhaps in crisis, are vulnerable and often ill at the point of transition, when their capacity to engage with decision-making is often compromised, and they need and want advice, support, and expert empathic help. One of the mechanisms social workers and their managers need to be alert to is the potential to outsource risk, stress, and responsibility to users and their families. What critics of the self-help model in medicine call the treatment burden. How far is the state transferring responsibility for care to the individual? And if it is, how far is this consistent with the social work values of alleviating distress, promoting social justice, and advocating for the rights of those older people whose voice is not heard? It is also useful to note that empirical evidence shows that there is a little variation in the effectiveness of the array of approaches in social work. It is the quality of the relationship between the social worker and the client, old-fashioned term, rather than the specific model of practice itself. It is only when eligibility criteria and the strengths-based approach meet that this is tested. This is my last slide. Sorry, Des. Interestingly enough, doesn't want to go forward, but never mind, we won't dwell on that. So thinking ahead then, and this I did struggle with a bit, I have to say, I think I'm not in any way saying there aren't strengths in strengths. Of course there are. But one of the things I've noticed about local authorities, and it's a real challenge for you guys working in local authorities, is no sooner have you got something up and running and it's going well, then you have to change it. And that makes capturing the impact and value and outcomes really, really difficult. Because that's what we keep being told as researchers we have to do. Do research, get evidence. Well, if you stood still for 5 minutes, we'd have a chance. It's very, very hard for us, and I completely understand it's hard for you. So I think we need to capture how strengths-based approaches are working. Where are they working well? And not just with the early intervention downstream stuff, with the really complex, high-level need stuff as well. We need to speak to older people about what matters to them, what is working differently. Have you even noticed the difference? Has it changed for you? Integrated care. We keep hearing about social cares in there somewhere. I've hardly ever read a thing, please correct me, Lynn, if I'm wrong on this, that talks about social work in integrated care. Why aren't we there talking about what we are doing in that context? Because I think that's going to be a lot about strengths. We need to acknowledge the tensions and challenges of investing in a model that speaks to the current neoliberal political agenda. Be wary. And be mindful that social work continues to focus on human rights issues, the process of care, social justice, not exploiting families in care, because I think there's a risk of that, and criticality. Don't forget, care management was the nirvana in the 1990s. It was, that was the answer. Now we're saying, oh, it's not the answer. So whatever the answer looks like, we've got to retain a critical lens, I would argue. So while the strengths-based approach certainly has value and could benefit many older people and their families, we need to be aware of its political location, the policy agendas that drive it, and how far we are engaging with the needs and concerns of older service users themselves in its development and delivery. Good practice cannot change the system. First, the system needs to change. Thank you.
It's a rare academic who knows that much and is humble enough to squidge it into 22 minutes. So thank you very much indeed, Alisoun. We've got a little bit of time for questions. As you know, we're tweeting, so I'd ask tweeters not to attribute the questions being asked. You know, you might want to say, we get this really wrong in my place of work, and we want to make sure you feel safe to do so. So we won't be attributing questions. Some really interesting points, and I'm delighted you finished on that critical note. We've got to keep thinking, not treat anything as a panacea. A very, very helpful note to end on. So comments, questions, thoughts, and heckles. We're all right with a bit of heckling, aren't we, if we need it? Yes. Anything you'd like to ask of Lynn and Alisoun? Because I think you've seen a really, really broad spectrum of thinking. At the back there. We're just going to bring a mic to you, sir.
Oh dear. It wasn't really a question, just a comment. I'm a hospital social worker, just finishing my ASYE, if and when I finish the paperwork off. I think this is the first time that I've been in a training and someone said it's more about not more about the relationship, but the relationship is one of the biggest things rather than the model, because I've really struggled with the idea that there's models and various things, but actually the relationship is something that I see very good at. I seem to be good at, I guess, blowing my own trumpet. So yeah, thank you for that. And just the general, I don't know what the actual word is for it, but the systems, and they do get quite demoralising, and it's sometimes hard to maintain that overall social work. This is what we're here to do, and actually we do get lost. And the lady, I forgot the lady's name earlier, who said about doctors being in charge of everything. I actually do enjoy having an argument with them sometimes.
Go for it.
Well, particularly around stroke patients particularly around stroke patients who are deemed not to be able to go home because they can't talk, or they can't make a cup of tea without possibly spilling themselves because they're going to fall and everything else. So Yeah, and I'm rambling now, so I want to give this to someone else. But thank you. Yeah, that's really good so far.
Lynn, do come in.
Lynn, what
Just on the integration, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Just on the integration point, actually, I could just do a plug. Yesterday we published through ADAS and through the Department of Health an advice note on social work within the integration of the context, where we're trying to really kind of galvanize people to take on the kind of top tips about how you make sure social work is firmly located and explicitly located within integrated arrangements. So you can access that on. Can you send a link?
Yeah, we'll send the link out to that, and also I know, Lisa, you led a resource within RiPfA, and we'll make sure we send both those and the link to that mini site around gerontological social work. We'll try and make sure we spread the learning after the day. Yeah.
One of the things I think social work is really good at is working in multidisciplinary environments, driving forward change, embedding some of the things the gentleman at the back was talking about. But I'm afraid I do think historically integration has been led as per usual by our huge, the NHS, the huge system that it is, and often by medics, although that's not necessarily fair. But I suppose I feel really concerned that we capture what social work's doing in integration. I mean, is that what you're saying the ADAS stuff is doing or not?
Well, it's mainly, it's sort of looking back a bit to learn lessons from where we've had supposed integration, particularly in mental health services, for example, and what have been the downsides of that. And partly that was about the social work, social care contribution got very watered down and became a very genericized model, which then became dominated by, well, what did the NHS need, or what did we need to do in terms of measurements and metrics that were required. And so that kind of contribution and that distinctive role got a bit lost. And that's led to, actually, lots of local authorities pulling their social care and social work out of integrated trust arrangements. And that's sad, actually, because what we needed to do is get that integrated approach right, rather than feel we've always got to go back to our separate ways. But and integration to me is really just about how do I, as a person, experience an integrated response to the complexity of my needs and wishes and things that need to happen. And people always say that, I don't care who it is who comes through the door to do this. I just want to feel that, there's a good understanding of who I am and how that response can pull things together in a way that makes a positive and helpful difference to me.
Can I make two more comments? Yeah. One is that I do feel social work is particularly vulnerable to being deleted for all sorts of reasons, including, I worry slightly about us all voting for our own demise, actually. But I'll leave that aside today, I think. But, I think because the evidence is that what social workers bring to the table is a combination of skills, it's quite difficult to keep that afloat in a team which says, what do you bring to the table, please? Is it an orange or an apple? Well, actually, it's a fruit salad. Well, I'm sorry, it can be quite tricky to pull out of something what social worker does. It's more that when they're not there, mental health services in an unnamed county council were like, oh, actually, gosh, perhaps we shouldn't have pulled social workers out because look at all the things that aren't happening. So it's almost when they'd gone, it was visible what they did. Do you see what I mean? The other thing I think is we are at a time where we are replacing expensive professional staff with cheaper non-professional staff, which is not, by the way, to have a pop at unprofessional staff at all. The care sector, I'm a massive fan of the third sector in social care, massive fan. And I think care home staff are some of the most abused staff in the country. But they're not social workers. So healthcare assistants are replacing nurses, and people with beware the long title in social care. Somebody with a great long assessment, reviewing, usually they're people doing what social workers used to do, in my experience.
Also a hospital social worker. And I think one of the complexities that I'm coming up against using this approach is that I'm being challenged more in relation to capacity assessments. Because if you're actually assessing somebody and the outcome is that they have insight and you empower or make the multidisciplinary team fully aware of the strengths that that patient or that individual actually has, and that's clearly been identified through the capacity assessment, because it's not fitting into their nice, neat little box, I am now being asked to revisit if that patient will not agree to have support on discharge from hospital. And I just feel that health using that approach is actually disempowering that individual, and we're trying to empower. So again, where we used to have the medical model versus the social model, and I actually felt that we were building those bridges, because we're now being asked to do what I feel we've always have done, but never ever have documented it. I think it's raising an all new level of challenges for us as professionals, and I am having to develop new skills, and I'm finding that increasingly difficult now.
And I really do sympathise with you. I think that some of this discourse is rightly raising these issues, but you're the people actually dealing with putting them into, operationalising them in practice and coming up against a sort of wall that was always there. But as you, and I think all I can say is keep going. I mean, I think it's tough for you, but you are right to be sticking to your guns. I mean, that's what you should be doing. And as some of us would say, it's what social workers should always have been doing, actually. I mean, I don't think there is an easy answer. I think you're right. I mean, I think clubbing together, I don't know if you've got colleagues you can meet up with regularly and share these.
My question to you as a professor is, who's actually monitoring that we're having as professionals and practitioners being not forced, but because of having someone in a position, where our profession is actually being challenged even further. But also because we're trying to promote that individual, but who's actually monitoring that and feeding it back?
Yes. Obviously, the whole Mental Capacity Act and Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards, the Law Commission have just yesterday, was it, or whenever it was, have published a whole recommendation about how to improve the system, and there's a lot of pressure on people. So it's worth having a look at that, and the ministers will be deciding at some point how they take that forward and what they respond to. I think it's absolutely true what you're saying about the Mental Capacity Act and the best interest approach, but it was developed in order to give a legislative safeguard to the people we're working with, and for many years they didn't have anything. And in those situations, often what would have happened would have been the doctor says you can't go home without this, so you've got to go to a care home. And quite frankly, that often did happen. So whilst it's a challenge and very, very difficult, it's also been a fantastic opportunity for us to position a better strengths-based support approach for people, where often in the past they may have been dismissed as not having capacity. So therefore, all these things will happen to them. So whilst it's challenging, it's an opportunity for us. And I think from what I hear you saying, we need to probably do a bit more about how we support people to have the skills and confidence to deal with that. And you do have a lot of power because you are the decision maker. And, in the past you weren't. So now you are, and that's nobody can argue with that. And however they may not like it, that is the case. And it actually gives a lot of power and strength to great social work with people in those interfaces. So we need to think about how we can support you. Obviously, there's monitoring going on about how many assessments people are being asked to do, and the numbers of deprivation of liberty safeguards are being put in place and so on. And we need to think about how we can capture that sort of information.
I'm going to invite a final question. I think the colleague just in front of you, Catherine.
Thank you. My name is Camille. I work for Southend Borough Council, and just recently we were discussing that implementing strengths-based approaches in social work, we've been looking at some training and rolling it out, but actually the whole training package needs to be infused with strengths-based approaches. Thinking about, we've got introduction to MCA every year, people go for refreshers. Where's the strengths-based approach in that? And I will be pushing to ensure that my colleagues and myself, we have the advice, the training to work in a safe way and be able to confidently challenge and be challenged. And because I worked in the hospital and I I've been often questions about the MCA slowing discharges, or actually people making decisions which were dangerous according to the hospital, and those skills were really necessary then. So I think going forward, we just need to do what we're doing. I think we're doing it right to the benefit of the adults, but acknowledge the challenges and support each other through training and the right structures.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Just to say, I mean, we're doing some work across with it, and Jenny, who's sitting next to you, is helping me kind of try and do a report that frames this. And we're certainly talking to the university sector about they need to be much more explicit in marbling into their qualifying programs strengths-based approaches as the kind of core foundation for social work, which I think was there, but not explicitly talked about in that way, and thinking about post-qualification and the assessed and supported year of employment and anything else, that we need to be much more bringing this out in sharper relief so that we are giving people this knowledge and skills and confidence to be privileging that approach whilst accepting all the other issues that people have to pick up on in terms of protecting people and safeguarding people and ensuring that the right things do happen.
I think we're going to close that session there. Thank you both very, very much indeed. You covered a huge amount of ground in a very short space of time, so I really appreciate that.